Welcome, Wargamers, to the icy undead plains of Ea, because today we are talking about another cinematic narrative expansion for Conquest, Crucible of Wills, Ashes, and Faith. If you are new to Conquest, first of all, welcome. The Crucible of Wills sets are a line of narrative expansions, completely optional, and the named characters in them aren't like tournament legal or anything like that, but in my opinion, they are packed with an immense amount of value, both in terms of models and fun scenarios to play. You'll get alternate sculpts for some killer hero units. There's always a lore setup to why these particular forces are fighting them, who's leading them, and there's like a full dossier on each leader, along with any regiment that they are renowned for working with. So there's rules to make these minis specific heroes and specific regiments, there's artifacts, all kinds of stuff. Along with 4 custom missions to tell the overarching story. And what I like is there's a mix of First Blood and Last Argument of King stuff, so I like how they're bringing that kind of skirmishy element into campaign play. Essentially, if one person in your group goes for the box, it introduces new missions and stuff you can all use, and I like it for that reason. And so today we're going to kick off our coverage of that campaign narrative, because the stories are so fun to read, and if your faction is included, I do recommend these sets, but for the rest of us, why not get a taste of that lore as well? And so in this video, we're going to kick it off by very simply introducing our characters and the stage that they act upon. Who are the army leaders? Where are we fighting? What are we fighting over? We'll get to all of that, but really quickly, if you're interested in these kinds of Conquest lore bits, please consider using my affiliate code over on Bellum. You'll get 10% off all your purchases, and it throws a tip in my tip jar at no cost to you. Bellum is great to work with, and they support content creators like myself, so it would mean the world to me if you would use that link. So this sordid tale requires a brief background on the two factions. In the description down below, I have a more detailed lore breakdown for both armies. I have a full playlist for Conquest lore. But I'm just going to give here the necessary highlights of the Nords and the Old Dominion armies and how they interact, because their past deeply matters. The Old Dominion was the largest unified human empire to ever exist. It was a theocracy, and the god in charge was very active and named Haslia, the premier god of humanity. In the beginning, Haslia was, like I said, active, attentive, helped inspire the humans below him to help kind of facilitate civic growth. But as this society grew to new heights, so too did Haslia's mind and will. Like, as they were worshiping this deity, the deity began to expand itself. It began to have ulterior motives and think bigger than the humans who were kind of worshiping it. So much so to the point where Haslia started to become aloof and somewhat distant. And that's really where the cracks began to appear in the foundations of what we now know as the Old Dominion. The civilization grew too big, it overextended itself, and without the active providence of Haslia, began to slow way down. Now keep in mind, they're still making pivotal moments in history as a faction, it's just a really slow process to disintegration. But this all came to a head when a band of sorcerers, priests, and wizards got together and dealt a fatal blow to Haslia, seeking to free mankind from the shackles of a false god. Haslia was struck down, but not destroyed. The god's essence mixing with the primordial forces of death, and was reborn anew as Haslia, the god of undeath. And what was an empire going through a bit of a rough patch was essentially annihilated in a nuclear bomb of necromantic magic, and the undead empire of a mad god was born. That's the Old Dominion that you and I get to play as in the game. Now, it's important to remember that in the history of the Conquest universe, not every human bent the knee to Haslia. I said it was humanity's premier god, but not necessarily exclusive. Some left as atheists, seeing Haslia not as a real deity, but of a manifestation of sciences that they were only beginning to understand. Those would be like the city-states, and some just wanted to kill Haslia, which would be the Sorcerer King's foundation, and others just walked away from the whole mess, seeing the empire falling apart. These are the foundations of the 100 Kingdoms. But one group in particular didn't bow or bend the knee because they have their own gods. They didn't need Haslia, and those are the Nords. In the far northern reaches, on the icy tundras and the coastal ground, another strain of humanity was thriving. It's shrouded in myth and allegory, but essentially the tale goes like this. There were a bunch of humans living in the cold, trying to scrape out a rough existence, when one day the gods descended, bridging the gap between the divine and the mortal realms. And these gods have names that are familiar to us: Odin, Loki, Heimdall, and so on. And this whole pantheon of gods descended and founded, or planted, I guess you could say, Yggdrasil, the great tree. And they came with a clear mission. The gods had come for warriors. Ragnarok is coming, and these deities will elevate mortals to their level so we can defend the world from the end. Now, the Nord culture went absolutely nuts for this. Like, they have trials and games and raids and clan warfare and all this kind of stuff, trying to prove to their deities, who are very active and standing right in front of them, that they deserve to ascend to the rank of Einherjar, a demigod, a mortal whose humanity is mingled and elevated with the divine. And the idea was that you'll be taken as an Einherjar, elevated and then kind of put into a stasis or a sleep until the time was right to defend the world from Ragnarok. Now, this happened for quite a while. Years go by, and many Einherjar are asleep, waiting for this event, but betrayal would spell the end. Loki, the trickster god, sabotaged the alarms of Yggdrasil, and the apocalypse did come, but instead of these kind of esoteric threats, it was an army of some very strange-looking warriors. Regardless, the army that was created for this purpose, the Einherjar, were never awoken. Yggdrasil burned, the old gods were struck down, but the Nords, the people under them, were not entirely wiped out. They've begun to rebuild and regrow, but they live in their own post-apocalyptic wasteland, by the logic of their stories. Some of the elements of the divine, some DNA strands, some other stuff, have imbued themselves into the Nord culture and trickled down through the ages, but they exist now as icy raiders and shattered people. Now, that preamble and discussion is the perfect segue to talk about our characters. And I promise, I glossed over a ton of things when it comes to the Old Dominion and the Nord culture. Go see my dedicated videos, but I hit those notes specifically because they come up. Our first character here is Andronicus, the Firebringer. This is your named Archimandrite model for the Old Dominion, and I think he's the best place to start for today's discussion. He is a veteran, a priest, and a hero of legend. Now, Andronicus' story begins all the way back when the Dominion was just starting to weaken, to really lose its momentum. He was orphaned at a young age, and like many such children, basically taken and offered up to the priesthood for service. So he was essentially put to work for the state. In that time, he was fashioned into a religious leader, both in the halls and churches of Haslia, but also on the battlefield. Now, along with a few other folks in this time when the god was becoming more distant, occasionally Haslia would send visions. Some of the last manifestations of the god's connection to mortals, and Andronicus once received such a vision. Once he achieved the mantle of Archimandrite and had some real power behind him, he received it. Far in the icy north, a new evil was brewing. Something was coming. A fire is starting and it needs to be snuffed out before it can spread. So with this vision, Andronicus rallied an impressive army and set out to conduct what would later be known as the Northern Crusades of the Old Dominion. Now, if you haven't pieced it out, this army is headed right for Yggdrasil. It's the army that the Nord pantheon had warned them about and was preparing for. Something went wrong, and the warriors who were designed for this exact battle were not awoken from their slumber. Andronicus' army descends upon the unprepared Nordic home, and there's just wholesale slaughter. In the chaos, Andronicus enters Yggdrasil, the Tree of Life, and sees that the tree is alive and full of all kinds of weird things he can't comprehend. Like, this is not just a big tree, there's some thing happening inside of it. And raising his hands and offering himself up, Andronicus basically allows himself to become a conduit of Haslia's destruction. A massive fire spell is unleashed with him as the epicenter, and basically this event focused the power of a god into one Archimandrite, and Yggdrasil burned. Somehow, miraculously, the body, or at least part of the body, of Andronicus was recovered. He was brought back to the Dominion and interred with all of the honors you can imagine. Alongside of him were some of the best looted items coming from Yggdrasil. Meaning that, they got in there, they plundered stuff, and then realized, well, he was the guy who saved the day, who did the whole thing, and sacrificed himself for his deity. So we'll put the good stuff in his burial grave. Fast forward to a point where no one saw coming. Haslia is reborn as the god of undeath. Necromantic power reanimates the kingdoms and vaunted heroes of the Dominion, and Andronicus the Firebringer rose again in service to his deity. Our other character in this story is Faithbringer Rainleaf. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. This is a named character of a class called the Vulva, essentially female wizards. And so Andronicus' story mostly ends at the pivotal moment of the Nords' history. And so for this character, well, Rainleaf is the fruit of the seeds that were planted long ago by that event. Not directly. I mean, it wasn't like, one of her father was there or something like that, but this is like part of her lineage, her culture. And so who is she? Few among the Nords value the written word, be it for education or art. But there are some that do. One of which is a man named Shaman Frode Runsold, who was really interested in the storing and aggregation of knowledge, specifically surrounding the history of the Nords, but even other stuff, how-tos, how to interpret different events from the Nords, art. He's surrounded by all this collected knowledge. But that man had a daughter, young Rainleaf. She was a bit of an odd girl, but she's very curious about the world and very sharp. She seems to have some kind of natural magic attunement, and there was an interesting story when she was a kid. Basically, she walked out to the forest and 2 crows appeared on a tree and began talking to her. Now, things like this happened in the children's myths of the Nord, so she as a young child probably thought, this isn't so weird. And the crows stayed with her, giving her advice, helping her navigate Nord society. And like I said, she did have some kind of latent magic, so these were, I almost perceived them as familiars to her in terms of this specific story that we often see in other kinds of fantasy. Now, I know the importance of the 2 crows when it comes to the idea of Nordic mythology and stuff like that, but for her, they acted like familiars. The crows help her get witty and wise and eventually direct her to join the Vulva Order, essentially an order of wizards that are all warrior women. Like a witch coven, but without any of the negative connotations that might be around that. But it's a circle of magic users where she develops into the person that we're going to get to know. She becomes laser focused, very sharp, her magic skills begin to improve, and she's a leader both as a scholar and, of course, on the battlefield, because this is also a warrior order. This is Rainleaf's level up moment. Now, the Vulva priesthood is interesting because it sort of soft rejects the legends of the old ones, basically saying, well, the old gods came to warn us about Ragnarok and buried a bunch of super warriors in waiting of such an event. The event happened and now the gods are dead, but what about those warriors? Those are still Einherjar. We should be looking for and revering them. Now, some have come out of their slumber a bit confused, but the principle is sound. Reclaim our mythic warrior caste and we can rebuild and conquer once more. So instead of just revering the gods themselves, they're looking for the demigods. The priesthood introduced that kind of thinking, and when she was ready, Rainleaf made the step of connecting her past and her present by paying a visit to her father. Remember, he has all this collected and accumulated knowledge, and she's able to sift through it because she's looking for something specific. Locations of Einherjar or artifacts the old gods used to elevate the Einherjar when she stumbles upon one. An old document written shortly after the burning of Yggdrasil mentioned a missing Welkrieg, I think this word is pronounced Valesigi. Walesigi. I looked it up. I tried to get a pronunciation for it, and there's nothing. Essentially, it's an old word used in Norse mythology for Valkyries. It would translate to Valkyrie in our language. But essentially, it's not to be confused with the Valkyrie regiment that you can play as. But in legend, these are the beings that would come to the battlefield and scoop up dead warriors, basically selecting who becomes an Einherjar. So we have an artifact that was instrumental in creating the Einherjar on her radar. So putting the clues from several documents together, Rainleafs believes that this artifact is located deep within Old Dominion territory at the temple city of Ayapetra, interred with some forgotten hero from forever ago. So those are the actors on our stage. Let's get to the where and the why, and then the basics here are somewhat straightforward. Andronicus is the man who burned Yggdrasil and took his life in the process. He was buried with things plundered from Yggdrasil in Ayapetra. One of those items is some sort of device used in elevating humans to the rank of Einherjar, ascending them to half-godhood. And after all this time, Faithbringer Rainleaf is here to collect her ancestors' things. What I do like here, despite the fact that I hate this word because I don't know how to pronounce it, is the plot device is of the Whale-Sergi. If you know the background of the Nords, you know that the beings that descended from Yggdrasil were not gods, but actually a form of alien known as the Outcasts. The Nords just couldn't understand the difference. They weren't building an army to stop Ragnarok. They were using local genetic stock as an organic defense system, taking humans, making them super soldiers to defend these interlopers themselves. All the mythical dramas that the Nords know are half-truths. The drama seems to be true, but not so much the details. So when we look at this device that chooses and elevates Einherjar, that's very interesting. And it's described like a divine servant, like a person, which does fit in with other things from the Outcast that we've seen. Another manifestation of that culture are the Spires, another faction in the game, so I could totally see this being an artificially created being. It makes me think of like C-3PO, but rather than a static automaton, this one probably has a little bit more of an organic effect to it, but can still really just do basic tasks, and all of that is well within the limits of Outcast technology. Now, as for why this story is cool, I like to end these videos with this. I love the connection between these two characters more than the other sets. Right? Having the guy who burned Yggdrasil is baller. And a person who is the direct consequences of that action coming to, sow the rewards or reap the benefits, tag him back, however you want to describe it, is really cool. Especially because the Nords are a faction that, like, within the context of other armies in the game, their intelligence is often kind of questioned. Oh, they seem like simple folk. Well, they're not simple. They just live a very hard life, because the ones of them who have even just a moment to breathe and think become incredibly dangerous. Whether in wielding magics, assembling huge armies, if one of them happens to have a mind for logistics, that entire coastline is in danger. Like, when they're sharp, they're highly dangerous. That said, if the Nords thought that the Dominion army that was mortal back in the day coming to Yggdrasil looked kind of strange, that's nothing compared to the way that exact same army looks today, where everybody's undead and rotting and lifeless. And so this story really picks up at the moment that Faithbringer is about to get this artifact back, and the story becomes the give and pull and the back and forth between them fighting over it. And so for the rest of the series, I'm just going to go scenario by scenario telling the story. I'll explain basically how the scenario works as an overview, but I'm going to keep it story-centric. If you'd like to follow along and you're enjoying these Conquest videos, please click subscribe and follow the Conquest playlist I have linked below. Thank you all so much for hanging out and listening, and I'll catch you in my next Conquest video. Happy wargaming.